Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to Shaping Tomorrow, Season 10. I'm Syafiq Borhannuddin, a fellow at IKIM. And in this second episode of Shaping Tomorrow, we have once again a guest from the US, Dr. Mariam Sheibani. Assalamualaikum, Dr. Mariam.
Alaikum salam.
Alhamdulillah. So before we proceed with this second episode on advancing Islamic thought in the West, please allow me to read to you her profile. Dr. Mariam Sheibani is an assistant professor at Brandeis University, USA, of Islamic thought, who is passionate about public education and community building. Prior to her current post, she was the Associate Academic Director and Head of Research at Cambridge Muslim College. She received her PhD in Islamic thought from the University of Chicago and postdoctoral training at Harvard Law School. At the University of Toronto, Harvard Divinity School, and in the University of Chicago. Her research interests are in Islamic intellectual, religious, and social history, with a focus on the theory and practice of Islamic law, ethics, and Sufism. Inshallah, her first book will be published next year, titled Islamic Legal Philosophy, Ibn Abdul Salam and the Ethical Turn in Medieval Islamic Law. Prior to her doctoral studies, she earned a BA in Public Affairs and Policy Management, and an MA in Legal Studies, and a second MA in Islamic Thought. She has studied with Muslim scholars and conducted research in Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, North America, the UK, and West Africa. Dr. Mariam, recently you've just released your own professional website, very interesting looking website, which outlines the kind of work you do and what you are offering as well in terms of your professional services. But I like the part where you mentioned on the fact that you believe that addressing the challenges of the 21st century requires us to draw on the depth, breadth, and diversity of the intellectual resources and social practices of historical Muslim societies. You also mentioned this inheritance is rooted in the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad SAW in 7th century Arabia, but spreads to the myriad of iterations of Muslim life in such varied regions as Muslim Spain and North Africa, the Arab provinces, the Balkans and Central Asia, West and East Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and the Malay archipelago. And I believe it's more and more, I think, scholars in the Muslim world as well as in the West, I think, who are beginning to see this approach of addressing the challenges that we face. It's not enough just to study what we had in the past, but to draw from them to respond to challenges. And I believe this is the kind of the work that you've been doing, as you have shared in our first episode on studying Muslim luminaries of the past. But yes, please, Dr. Mariam, we can ask you to elaborate what you mean by this. Yes.
Yeah, I think in the present moment that we live in, we are inheriting an Islamic tradition that we have to, of course, preserve, and I think we focus on the preservation a lot. But we also have to continue to develop the Islamic tradition. It's not meant to just be passed down. It's meant to be continuously developed, evolving, responding to the social needs of the time. And of course, the 20th and 21st centuries have had radical changes and shifts in many different areas. And we have to draw on to be able to address some of those challenges, not just, one tradition, one fiqh tradition, or one cultural tradition, but we have, especially in a globalized world, we are heir to multiple traditions within Islam. And I think oftentimes we become a little bit narrow-minded about what we are drawing on, or what we are familiar with, or maybe what we're comfortable with. But I think, even having traveled a little bit in the Muslim world, seeing and knowing a little bit about different diverse Muslim histories, that the way in which Islam was embodied and lived in places like West Africa or the Malay world or the Indian subcontinent, many rich traditions and possibilities, not just intellectually, like in law, that we have multiple madhabs, which is part of the rahmah of the Sharia, that you have multiple options in many respects, but also like the social practice of how Muslim communities have practiced and made certain things customary in order to facilitate daily life, in family life, in economic transactions, in communal worship, etc. Especially, especially in the West, where we are inheriting all of those traditions, like we're diaspora communities from different parts of the Muslim world, and there is no regional culture we're drawing on.
Mm.
There's no local history we're drawing on.
Yeah.
It's a mishmash of all the Muslim cultures, right?
Mm.
So I think it's important, and given that many of the challenges we have as minority communities, many of them are also universal. Challenges around raising children, or around marriage and divorce, and social customs with parents, etc. These are things that the global ummah is dealing with, right?
Yes.
So I think we have to be expansive in the possibilities that we draw on, and that's where I think research and ongoing cultural practice is important as well.
Very interesting. And I think you are doing this in terms of addressing challenges on various fronts. I believe you are not just limiting yourself just to the ivory tower, to the academia, but you're doing many, and also not limiting yourself only to the West. You have, as we have learned in the first episode, you're already doing something with partners in Qatar, for example, and now in Malaysia, of course. But what's your view? Having worked with other students and representatives of Islamic thought, other scholars, how do you view in terms of how we should advance Islamic thought in general? Coming from the West, and what do you see the way forward for this?
Yeah. I think there's a number of different dimensions to this. The one thing you mentioned at the beginning about academics, we're not great at sharing the research insights we have, or sharing what the implications are for the community. So I think academics learning, it's actually, it's like media training. You learn how to speak to the media. You also have to learn how to speak to a public audience. So I think more Muslims academically trained learning how to do that, how to translate their research and their field of research for the community broadly, and also for other service providers and practitioners. So, for example, the work I do in Islamic law and ethics, I'm learning how to teach and train mental health professionals and service providers. Right, they're working with families on the ground, and they need to know a little bit, understand the basic tools and structures of Islamic family law, ethics, ethical reasoning, conflict resolution. These are things that they're not jurists, they're not meant to be jurists, but they need some tools. Right.
Yep.
So I think academics learning how to do that. I think Muslim scholars traditionally trained also learning, the pedagogy of traditional teaching is self-reproduction. I'm a jurist and I train jurists. That's important. But you also have to now learn, given the fact that everybody is literate and has many important questions, you have to also learn, how do you speak to the non-jurist in training?
Sure.
Right. So I think there's multiple things that need to happen in terms of translation, right, of research, translation of traditional teachings. And so that's, one thing. Another thing is the fact that, there's in developing and furthering Islamic thought and Islamic intellectual traditions, I think it also has to be done collaboratively. This long list of Muslim life across Spain and North Africa, the Balkans, Central Asia, West and East Africa, Indian subcontinent, Malay archipelago. There are multiple traditions that have lasted for centuries, multiple languages. There has to be ways of being able to intersect of Muslims and researchers doing work in different places, being able to speak and to share and to collaborate on research. Oftentimes, any given question that we're thinking about, 20 other groups of Muslim researchers are thinking about somewhere else in the world, but we often don't read each other's work. There might be, language, translation barriers, but I think being able to connect on, because again, there's so much work to be done. And if I take 2 steps forward and then no one builds on that, and someone else takes the same 2 steps forward, there has to be a way of kind of working on these things together.
Complementing each other.
Absolutely.
And it's very interesting the fact that I think in the past, our ulama, although they don't have internet, yet somehow they complement each other superbly, tremendously, in ways that enrich the whole tradition, the whole civilization. And I think today we don't have any excuse not to do that much better, in the service of the whole Muslim Ummah, the global Muslim Ummah, as well as for humanity. And indeed, as you said, I think a lot of the insights of the scholars of the past and from our whole entire teachings of Islam have a lot to offer. Those in the practitioners as well.
The practitioners, absolutely.
Sector,
I think that's a really majorly missing piece. The people that are doing the people who are educating, the educators, the service providers, the people in law and legal practice, I think they're really underserved. And it's because it's not just when you train them, you're not just benefiting them individually, you're benefiting everybody that they work with and they serve, right? Exactly. So it's kind of a
multiplier effect.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, like, for example, like when you studied Izzuddin Abdul Salam, and when you study it within a broader context, imagine if like our policymakers and leaders in the Muslim world understand what is required to produce a scholar like that, who would subsequently have an immense impact on his society, on his milieu, in future generation. And it took someone like Salahuddin, for example, to create a very potent educational system to produce someone like that. And I think in many ways, I think even from your studies on Izzuddin Abdul Salam could provide many insights, even for policymakers, for leaders, to chart our future trajectory, our collective trajectory in a better direction.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the main lessons from that, even the way you just framed it, Salahuddin ibn Abdul Salam, like these things take time. And I think a lot of the seeds that we're planting, we might never actually see the fruit.
Sure.
Salahuddin, there's like 3 generations till Ibn Abdul Salam, but it took, the revival of Damascus, the institutions, the scholars to come and rebuild Damascus, the Shafi'i tradition of Damascus. Ibn Abdul Salam is born, so I think many of these things, in this hyper like speed culture we live in, we expect to see things immediately. Results, I think in many ways, many of the things we're discussing, I would love to know in 2 generations they're there. Inshallah, they'll be in our generation, but at the very least, it's just sometimes we're still having the same conversations 20 years later, and there's been nothing, no steps forward. So I think we have to really think and plan long term as well.
I'm also interested to know your thoughts. I mean, now with your new project in Qatar, with partners in Qatar, I mean, just curious. I mean, what are the possibilities you see now? Because I think the fact that with Al Mujadilah, this project spearheaded by Sheikh Moza, the Queen of Qatar, I think is very exemplary in terms of tapping in the scholarly strength from Muslims from other places, right? I think, how do you think we can do this better? Because we have places like Malaysia and Turkey now, I think emerging centers of Muslim learning, Islamic scholarship. How do you think we can work together better, Dr. Mariam?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's really experimental. So like Mujadil is a new project, one of like several collaborations that I have, and I don't feel like I can speak to. I haven't visited yet. I'm just a visiting a collaborator as a researcher, so I don't know exactly the contours of that project. But I think, like you're saying, there are these I think there's new centers of Islamic thought we're recognizing. Qatar is one, Turkey is another, Malaysia definitely. So I think being able to draw the connections and connect the individuals who can then create more institutional cohesion. I think, the UK is another kind of on this side of the Atlantic. The UK is another hub. So I think in as much as we're able to work together and collaborate on these projects, and I think, again, what exactly that can do long term, I think that remains to be seen, and I think it'll take time to see the fruits of that as well.
Indeed. Dr. Mariam, also earlier you were talking about how you are trying to advance Islamic thought to those as well as amongst the professionals, as well as in the wider community. But maybe you could share with us your efforts to bridge the Islamic thought, Islamic intellectual tradition with outreach programs, which you've done quite a bit, and I think I believe you have upcoming courses as well. Perhaps you can share with us the kind of initiatives that you have done and you plan to do.
No, part of this, the importance, as I mentioned, of academics being able to speak to a wider audience. I think the importance of public education. I don't know that we have a robust, framework for how we teach individuals who are not training to be scholars, right? What is it that they require to understand of Islamic law, for example, of hadith, of history, of applied spirituality? Like, what are their needs? And like the basic framework in education that we learn is backward design, right? So the entire curriculum of, study of mutun and the traditional curriculum is backward designed to create a jurist, right? But now we find Muslims who just want to know more. They're being told to study a traditional curriculum that is meant over 20 years of full-time study to make you a jurist, right? And it's, why would they be studying? What do they need to understand of hadith, for example, is not necessarily a text on the categories of hadith, right? They need to understand the history and the authenticity and the framework. And, those things are what's important.
As part of their fardu ain, personal fardu ain,
and that's
lifelong
changed.
program.
I mean, people,
it's dynamic,
100 years ago, people, the vast majority, 97% of people weren't literate, right? So now, we have high degrees of literacy, and people have important questions that to really answer them, they have to study a very long time.
And they have modern
right?
questions, unresolved modern questions.
Absolutely. So I think what I mean by backward design is backward design of what does a educated, intelligent, curious young person today, what is it that they need to understand of these various fields? What are their questions? What do they need in terms of practice and implementation, and building curriculum along those lines, right? So I'm trying to work in the areas that I'm an expert in of Islamic law and legal history, of hadith studies, of applied spirituality, history and thought. Those are the areas that I'm working on building courses and curricula of courses that I would make available both online and also in person for people.
Fantastic. I hope our friends in the religious agency in Malaysia will take note of your efforts and maybe somehow partner with you and or learn from your efforts as well. But I think I'm also curious to learn about your efforts to introduce Islamic thought in American universities. You've taught at places like in Harvard, in Chicago itself, where you studied. Can you perhaps share with us how do you do this? In a Western academia setting.
Yeah, I think for me, it really complements like the teaching I do in the community, the teaching I do in the university. There's a lot of overlap there, even the training of practitioners. So, in the university, typically I'll have a mixed class of Muslims and non-Muslims.
Exactly. Yes.
Many of the Muslim students, this is like the first time they're taking an academic course in Islam.
Really?
So they're kind of curious, the fact that I'm Muslim and, I'm a practicing Muslim gives them some degree of safety. There's also, Shia students, Sunni students, occasional Ismaili students. So it's really a reflection of the Ummah in the classroom, students of other religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and so on. So, it's a nice, I think for the Muslim students, I've had students say like, this is the first time I've been able to ask these type of questions. I can't ask them in my family. I can't discuss these things, in the mosque and Sunday school. So I think it gives them a space to be able to have those discussions, difficult discussions, and be able to really have an experience in being able to really think critically about their tradition, their own kind of practice as well, and their own commitment to the faith.
Right.
I think the non-Muslim students introduce a really interesting element of the type of questions they ask. Or also sometimes they're just watching the Muslims have a discussion. They're like, oh, okay. Sometimes they have parallel concerns or debates in their own religious tradition. It might be like, this is actually very similar to what the Jewish community challenge they have. So I think, it's very, it also forces me to be able to, you assume zero knowledge of non-Muslims. So I have to make sure anything I'm saying and explaining has to be accessible to a zero background person, right? So I think in many ways it kind of keeps me on my toes. It forces me to think about if I want to teach Islamic legal philosophy to a non-Muslim student, what are the concepts and the steps I have to take to have them appreciate something like the Maqasid tradition, right? So I think as an educator, and even just like the ongoing development of pedagogy in the university of what is the cutting edge, like the science of learning, how do people learn today? Right. There's an entire science that I don't think we as Muslim educators are often trained in. So I think learning and benefiting from that experience and continuously improving as a university instructor, I think helps me in my own development. I think it's for the Muslim students, it's an important experience for them. The non-Muslim students to learn about Islam from a Muslim, with a classroom of other Muslims, I think is also very, a good experience. So yeah, I think it's important, and for me, it's important to continue to do that as well.
Is this are these considered like optional courses that they have the choice to choose? Okay.
If there are majors in that department, so I used to be in a history department. Now I'm in a Near East studies department. If they're majors, then sometimes maybe not that course, but like courses like that. But usually, especially the Muslim students, they come from biomedical and business. Like they're just interested in taking something about Islam. So usually they're from different backgrounds.
I think, and I suppose this is part of the liberal arts approach in American universities.
Exactly. Global studies and things like that.
Fantastic. And especially for Muslims in the West these days, of course, we learn more about their thoughts through social media sometimes. But what do you find, like you must have noticed some patterns in the recurring line of questions. Are they always existential philosophical questions, or is it more something more less deep than that, or what are some of the questions that you had to deal with over the years teaching in American universities?
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm noticing is a lot of questions around gender norms, family law, it's the history of Islamic law, trying to understand certain Quran and Sunnah teachings.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of questions people have about what do these things mean, what's their context, how do they make sense in that context, and then of course are they applicable today? I think the area of Islamic law has and hadith studies, there's a good portion of questions and concerns in that area. And I think always, Muslims are looking to deepen their own spiritual and ethical cultivation. So I think across the board and across time, a lifespan of a Muslim, I think there's always interest in how do I, deepen my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How do I better understand myself and my relationship with Allah and my own life experience in relation to that? So I think that's an ongoing need, in addition to some of the areas of more kind of academic, intellectual.
But do you sense like sometimes it's perhaps not expressed or articulated by the students, but there's a sense of a doubt about the truth claims of Islam, for example. I think there was a study by a IKIM Institute about the numbers of doubt among Muslim community in the West, I think. But do you feel like this is a major problem as well? I mean, the fact that because you are in that kind of environment in the West, when there's any discussions on, I mean, even in academia, the question of truth is being relegated or put aside these days, right? But how do you sense this issue?
Yeah, I think that's there. I don't know that for me, I think having questions and having doubts is like it's a channel or a conduit, an opportunity for greater certainty. I don't think that. I think oftentimes there's like a shame around asking or wondering or having these questions or being interested and curious and understanding these things. I think I think any intelligent Muslim who is reading and trying to understand, I think they should have questions. I'd be surprised if they didn't. I just don't think there's often the right forums or places where they can have those conversations and not just be told how, not just be told what it is, but told how it works.
Yeah.
Right. So I think being fields that we're not familiar with, like how does finance work?
Okay.
I'm not going to be a subject matter expert, but if you can break it down and explain to me how it works and where I plug myself into that, right? That's what people need, not just, trust the market, right? But how does the market work? Explain to me how the market works. How can I trust? Or even like medicine, people need to have the basic understandings of how they take care of themselves and their health. They're not medical doctors, right? So I don't think we've done a good job of being able to explain, how does a hadith corpus, how did it come together? I think any Muslim living in the West today has some type of question around the authenticity of hadith because of it's in the air, right? And I don't think we've done a good job of explaining and not just, again, stating facts, but demonstrating and showing, right? Showing in a sophisticated way, giving them access to the sophistication of that tradition. So I think it's there. I think people have different ways of managing it. There's like the cognitive dissonance of just living with that. I think if it touches your personal experience, and oftentimes with women with some gender norms, if somehow they've been affected by the use of those things in their families, in their communities, I think then it becomes hard to sustain that reconciliation.
Dr. Mariam, before we end our conversation with you, we've learned a great deal, alhamdulillah, in terms of your experiences and insights to advance Islamic thought in the West and beyond the West as well. But as you well aware that I think the Muslim community is supposed to be the middle community, the ummatan wasatan. They're supposed to be the community that sort of continue to play a role to make sure that whole humanity, when they are gone to various kind of extremes, to continue to offer the most just position, most just solution. In the context of Islamic thought today, Dr. Mariam, how do you think we can better position or showcase or advance Islamic thought as a kind of a solution for humanity, for the global challenges that we face, rather than it being on the periphery, only as a field of study in universities, but it should be at the forefront, at the very least amongst our Muslim leaders, Muslim governments, right? If not, if the global international community don't want to put that in the forefront of their discourse agenda, it's fine. But at least amongst the Muslim community, how can we put advanced Islamic thought at the forefront or recenter it as a solution provider in the world today? Dr. Mariam, please.
Yeah, I think it's a big question. I think, the importance of those who are involved in Islamic thought and its development being able to speak to other audiences. Part of the problem is, when you're talking about people who are in policy or government, we haven't translated the outcomes or the takeaways, the conclusions of our research in a way that's digestible by people who are not subject matter experts, right? So I think that's really important. In addition to having continuously as collaborative research and thought development among ourselves, we have to have a discussion at a certain level, but after that or alongside that, being able to translate those outcomes for people who are shouldn't be expected to keep up with the details and the theoretical discussions that we have. I think that's important. I also think that on the one hand, it's important for us to have our values and our ideals fleshed out and know where we stand. Like when you talk about the economic system that we are, swim in, the global economic system, the capitalist systems that we're involved in, the environmental crisis, on the one hand, there's an ideal of what the Islamic solution would be if we were to start from zero, right? I think having those ideals spelled out is important. And then I think from there, figuring out how do we actually implement and embody those individually, and then as social practices, again, how do you create social movements from those ideals and those values? But at the same time, I think sometimes we're a little bit too idealistic almost, unless it's, and I think a good example of that in our history even is the political theory of the caliphate, right? We have these beautiful ideals that nobody has met, nobody has checked off those boxes since the beginning of Islam, right? But they still continue to teach and to have that as an ideal of this is what it should be, even if the reality on the ground is very, very different, right? So I think as Muslims, on the one hand today, sometimes we think that the ideal theory of the caliphate was Muslim history, right? So we have to recognize that ideals are important and theories of what things should be is important, but then not saying if it's not going to be that, then nothing, or it's useless or it's pointless, right? So I think we have to be pragmatic and make the concessions when we have to make the concessions, but not lose sight of, well, this is the original theory of what political leadership or economic justice or environmental sustainability, what it looks like, even if today we're only able to do X, Y, and Z individually or communally. So I think both are important.
That's a very thoughtful response, Dr. Mariam, and it deserves much more contemplation and perhaps action as well. I think what you're suggesting there is very practicable, practical for many. In terms of recentering Islamic thought in today's global discourse, rather than focusing only on periphery issues. I think there's a very important need, and I think individuals like yourselves and I think many partners in the Muslim world and in the Western world as well are much more equipped to do that. I think so. We're in good point of history in the Muslims' history at this day of age to do something as how you have indicated, Dr. Mariam. Thank you so much for your time, for your insights. Inshallah, we hope to have you again at IKIM and as well as on Shaping Tomorrow. Thank you once again, Dr.
Enjoyed
Mariam.
the conversation. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been having our conversation with Dr. Mariam Sheibani. She's Assistant Professor of Islamic Thought at Brandeis University. And in this episode, we were discussing on the question of advancing Islamic thought in the West. But also in the first episode, she has shared with us extensively on studying Muslim luminaries of the past. With that, thank you very much. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamu alaikum warahmatullahi